as long as we're aware, we're all sort of online. It's good fun, this SDTV.
Oh, yeah.
Right, we're online on YouTube, live stream. Welcome to SDTV. And we're online with students. And I think, Jude, if you want to press record, that's even more supreme. So two sessions in 2 days, very, very exciting. And really delighted to hand this over to the amazing Judah Armani, who's going to be talking to his good friend Micah Sherer, who's been working with students on a variety of topics already. But this is your chance to shine, Micah, and tell us about what you do. So thanks so much for joining us. All the people watching live, all the people watching recordings, have a great session. Thanks, Judah. Thanks, Micah.
Bless you. Thanks, Clyde. I think, Michael, I'm going to hand over to you in a second to just go through a presentation. But for those of you that haven't heard Mike speak before, there's a really interesting and wonderful set of experiences that have taken him all around the world. And what I'm particularly excited that Mike is going to be sharing about is actually the use of what we know as service design skills and practices by someone that hasn't necessarily gone through a service design background or that kind of experience, but actually trained as an economist and looking at being able to create opportunities for people around the world through enterprise and the seagulls in the background. Yeah, so I'm from the Brighton office, so that's our attempt at wanting to create an even more diverse kind of like offering here. But yeah, really, really excited to hear about Micah's use of all of these skills that we as service designers would assume that we have been learned and taught, and actually they're being deployed by people from completely different practices. And I hope that we can deep dive, especially into areas of co-creation and understanding communities and neighborhoods and deploying that in some really radical ways. But I'm not going to give too much away. And certainly if, Michael, you don't get onto talking about it, I'm going to definitely deep dive into your culinary skills, because actually they really bring about some of that key elements of understanding neighborhood. So over to you, sir, and then maybe we're gonna do a bit of Q&A at the end and open up the floor to some questions as well.
Very cool. Thanks, Judah. Yeah, so if everybody can see the presentation that I'm screen sharing, great. Yeah, I'm gonna be just talking a little bit about designing for social change and bringing up a lot of themes that came up in this one-on-one sessions that I already got to do with, I think, about 20 students last month, which was great. It really, I think, puts me at an advantage for this presentation of already sort of knowing some of the questions that are coming up, some of the issues that are coming up, some of the unifying themes that I saw in the projects, and maybe things that could be addressed. So the way I'm kind of going to go about it is we're going to have sort of talk about three different things. We're going to talk about designing around power structures. We're going to talk about designing for sort of people at the bottom of the food chain. And then we're going to talk about designing with relationship in mind. And then we'll kind of bring that back together at the end and talk about how those things sort of unify to maybe bring a different focus or a different path towards social change. And these are not only themes that came up with the students I was talking to, but also have come up repeatedly through all the different sort of businesses I've started, through all the different companies I've worked for. It's just come up over and over again. So let's start with power structures. So when you are designing for social change, you really have to take into account existing power structures. And to sort of show you what I mean by that, I want to start with a little bit of a story from when I was working for a coffee import-export company that was specializing mostly in South American coffees. We had a customer who was a pretty high-end, large customer in the States who ordered a coffee directly from a farmer. It was a relatively small lot, just about 30 sacks of coffee, so 30 sacks at 70 kilos. And they'd ordered the coffee directly from the farmer. We handled the import, export of the coffee. It arrived for the roaster, and due to basically the things that can happen in shipping of an organic product, the coffee had declined slightly in quality by the time it arrived. And by slightly, I mean, we're talking on a scale of, 1 to 100, the coffee declined by maybe 1 point. So not something that we would typically be all that concerned about, but something that the customer was extremely concerned about because he was planning to use the coffee for quite a special release. He was going to sell it for a lot of money. And so this customer basically used his power in this supply chain relationship to say, look, I'm rejecting this coffee, even though I've had a relationship with this farmer for the past 5 years. And, the coffee's been consistently good for 5 years. I'm rejecting this lot of coffee. I'm not going to pay for it. So what happened in that scenario is essentially that risk of the coffee and whether it was going to be accepted essentially kept getting passed up the food chain. So the roaster passed the risk on to us as the importer. We passed it on to the exporter and said, well, we're not paying for the coffee since it's not been accepted by the customer. The exporter then passed the buck essentially to the farmer and said, look, customer's not paying for the coffee. You're not getting paid for the coffee. And I think this is really illustrative of the dynamics that power structures create when you're trying to design for social change. Because the person in this relationship with essentially the least money and the least power was the farmer. He's the one who's most in need of the sale. He was the one who could least afford to take the hit of losing the sale of these 30 bags of coffee. But essentially, he's the one who didn't have any choice in the matter. And that was really illustrative to me of the different types of power that could exist in the coffee supply chain, but really in any supply chain, and of a lot of the problems that are sort of baked into that. There is something called the power funnel, which I'll show to you, and I've designed it as a power Chemex. The Chemex is quite a famous coffee brewer that's shaped in that same way. And I feel like this is really instructive in demonstrating how power is sort of stratified in any industry. And this is just coffee as an example, because that's what I've worked in for most of the past 15 years. But if you see the bases of power both at the top and the bottom of the funnel, so the consumers and the farmers, they both have incredibly broad bases of power. So in other words, consumers drive demand. If consumers could somehow all unite together and they could all take collective action, the amount of power they would have would be massive. But the problem is that they don't unite together because, it's quite a broad base. You can't unite 5 billion coffee customers all around the world. There's no way, there's no mechanism to do it. And the information is really restricted in terms of how you could do that. And it's the same thing with farmers. If coffee farmers, for instance, could all band together, then those coffee farmers could set the price of coffee. They could all basically function as a massive cartel. But as we know, when something's that diluted, there's never going to be enough power. So although there's never going to be enough cooperation, really. So even if that base of power is super broad, it's not focused enough for them to have enough power to actually make a difference. And part of that as well is information. Information is always restricted through essentially the smallest part of the funnel. In the coffee industry, that's importers and exporters who are controlling that flow of information. So for instance, in that situation where a roaster rejected coffee, that information about what had happened to the coffee, what happened with the contract, what all the legal ramifications of that were, that was controlled through the importer and exporter. So they were quite sure that they were not going to take any risk. They weren't going to take the fall in this situation. And they were going to be able to have control, even though they're just middlemen, because they're essentially restricting all of the flow of information. And they're at the middle of the funnel where there aren't very many players in the game, which is a different type of power. So that really gives us a few points that we have to design around when we're looking to design for social change, I think. The point that power has to be consolidated to be effective, the point that the flow of information controls who has the power in any relationship, and then finally money as a type of power, but often it's not really who has the most money. It's about risk shifting, and it's about credit terms, and it's about things like that. It's about the idea that I, as a roaster, might not have the most money in the situation. That might be the importer or exporter, but depending on the credit terms that I've accepted for that coffee, I may be able to shift risk, and I don't have to take the risk on myself. So if we think, when we were thinking creatively about how to get around this problem, how to pass more control back to the farmers as an importing company that was trying to design a better way to do contracting, we had to think of ways of shifting this power back to the people who wouldn't have an opportunity to have it otherwise. So this was things like creative contracting, making roasters write contracts that said, they would take the coffee regardless of the quality. Maybe there would be a price reduction depending on if the quality had suffered a little bit. And that gave back a little bit of control to the farmers. We had to think of creative ways of doing that legally and fiscally speaking, though. So that brought us to looking into blockchain as a way of writing the contracts, because that was a way with the discrete ledger that the final customer could be assured of the payment that we made to the exporting company and the payment that the exporting company made to the cooperative, the processors, the farmers, the people downstream from them, or upstream, I suppose. So when we were designing for ways to shift risk, we had to always be thinking of who had the power in these relationships and how we can shift it. And that leads sort of directly into the idea of designing for people who are at the bottom of the food chain. When you're designing for social change, this is sort of one of the most obvious things, right? If we're doing human-centric design, which is a common theme, if we're designing for social change, we have to design for the humans who wouldn't otherwise have something designed for them. We have to design for the people who need it the most. And that is a really surprisingly tricky thing to do. And one way, or one example of that I was doing in the same job, essentially the import-export company, was designing a smallholders program for Ethiopian farmers who wouldn't otherwise have the chance to sell their coffee directly to the consuming market. When we designed this program, we essentially designed around new laws that had been put in place in Ethiopia that allowed for direct export from a farmer without an intermediary, such as a cooperative, something like this, to export the coffee. That was a new law change that took place while I was based in Africa, doing coffee buying for the company. And so it really gave us an opportunity to jump on that, be the first ones to market with a really unique product, which was a single farmer Ethiopian coffee, which is quite a common product from any other country, but hadn't been done in Ethiopia just due to the legislation that was involved. But when we started setting this up, we found that something that wasn't being done by other companies trying to set up a similar program was interviews with key stakeholders, as I would call them, or unimportant stakeholders, as some of my competitors thought, and that would be the farmers themselves. And one of the interesting things is, when you try to guess at what people at the bottom of any food chain, whatever it is, the most marginalized people group in any country, any business, if you try to guess at what they need, you'll almost always be wrong. Especially as someone from, the northern world trying to work in the southern world, or, from a richer country trying to work in a less well-off country. So things that were really, really important to the farmers themselves in Ethiopia were not things that were really being that were marketable in Europe or the US. And so they weren't things that were really being addressed. So I'll give you a couple examples of that. Things that farmers don't care about is having their picture taken, being put on the website of the company, having their quote unquote story told. All very important to people in the marketing world, all very important to our competitors who are setting up programs such as this, all extremely unimportant to the farmers. The farmers cared about being paid more for their coffee. They cared about being paid early for their coffee, so not having to wait for their payment, because they were used to selling their coffee cherries to a cooperative, which would pay them immediately. And what a lot of our competitors did was try to use the typical coffee import-export model, where they would be paid when the coffee arrived to the port. And that was really unsuccessful, because these people needed cash. They needed cash fast. And if you didn't give that to them, then they had no interest in selling their coffee to the project. And so that was something that from doing interviews with these people directly, and by working with really good local partners, which sound like really obvious things, but they're not something that gets done very often when designing for people who are more disadvantaged. We'll do maybe a bit of cursory research, but then we'll go in with what we think is best without considering what those people need. And I'd like to sort of point you guys as well. It's a bit of research that's quite common in the development world, but is less common in the design world, and that's Amartya Sen. He's quite a well-known researcher in the development studies sort of world. And in a nutshell, his big thing is the capability approach. So Amartya Sen basically acknowledged that we typically can't guess at what will be valuable to any given person. Unless they're from basically the exact same background as we are, we're not going to be very accurate at guessing that. So what we should do is make sure people have the ability or the capability to proceed and pursue a life that they have reason to value, without us trying to dictate what they should have a reason to value. And I think when designing for social purposes, that has to be taken into account. You have to think less of your own knowledge, and think more of what those people for whom you're trying to design know about themselves. And it's a really simple mindset change, but I think a really critical mindset change that can be done really smartly and really well. So I wanted to show you this slide in sort of that same idea of designing for people at the bottom of the food chain. And this is a bit of an aside, but it's, I think, an interesting one, just to show you for the coffee industry, the cost breakdown of basically when you buy a latte or a flat white at a cafe, where's that money going? And as you see at the top in the green of the left-hand column, 10p out of your 250 is going to the coffee itself. And of that, only 1p is going to the farmer at the end of the day. And so those really are the people at the bottom of the food chain. Those are the people in my industry that you have to design for. You have to find creative ways of making sure that their power is increased, as we talked about, and make sure that, their money is increased and that their say in in basically the overall industry is addressed. Because even in the coffee portion of the 10p in your 250 cup, 8p of that is going to essentially consuming country entities, and only 2p of it is going to producing countries. So we're really sort of flattening the power of the people who are at the bottom, and we need to find ways to design around that. So the last point that I really wanted to bring up was designing for relationships. There is a whole lot of turnover in any industry, and in design, there's a lot of pass through. You're trying to often design yourself out of the equation. You're trying to set up a process that's going to, sort of in an automated way run on its own. But there's a really creative and compelling argument for designing in a different way. I think that designing in a way that is based on relationship. And as an example of this, I'll give an example from the organization I currently work for, which runs a coffee roastery as a nonprofit, but also runs a coffee training school called Pro Baristas. It's the biggest coffee training school in the UK, but it's also run as a nonprofit, which gives us, I think, a lot of really unique competitive advantages in the way that we proceed in doing business. Now, the normal model for the coffee training school, or really any school, is you get students, you teach the students something, and you pass them along. It's a bit of a conveyor belt. And whether you have a good alumni network and you stay connected with people afterwards, that's sort of more or less up to the students themselves. There's not a specific design for staying connected, essentially, with the students, and particularly in the for-profit education model of basically a skills training center like Pro Baristas is. It's basically as fast as you can whack people through, you make more money. But us as a charity, we have sort of a different model, because we can have a different model as a nonprofit. And we have really focused on doing coffee training, doing good jobs, skills training, and placing people into jobs, but really focusing on staying connected, staying in relationship with the people we work with. And I think that's been incredibly powerful. There's some things that we've really seen work through that, such as we focus a lot on soft skills, whereas other training centers would focus a lot on hard skills. Quite often, the people who go into service work, like a coffee job, are people who aren't really suited to, other jobs. They're people who are coming in quite low skill workers, quote unquote, quite entry level workers. And a lot of times they don't have good soft skills. And whether or not they stay in a coffee job for the rest of their life, any soft skills you can impart on them are going to serve them well throughout the rest of their life, not only in that job. So we focus on that quite a lot. We also focus on maintaining connections with people over time. So instead of just bringing people in for their course and whacking them through the course and out the door, we offer things like free drop-ins that allow people to stay connected with us as an organization, to continue to get support if they need support. And some of those people we stay connected with for years on end. So we'll see them go through their first coffee job, leave it, go on to another one, and they stay connected through dropping in, chatting with us. And that connection allows those people to stay supported and to stay basically as productive members of their teams, because they have built-in support that's not necessarily coming from the job itself, which is really, really critical for people to be able to do a good job. This also really reduces turnover in an industry that's absolutely rife with turnover. If you maintain a relationship with employees, or if they have good relationships outside of their workplace, then it's often much more likely for them to stay in the job long term. And we're really acknowledging that real change happens over time. You know, nobody flips a switch and becomes a different person. When you're designing for social change, you need to sort of acknowledge that a lot of the people you're working with may not be very high capacity people. They may not be people who pick things up quickly. They might not be people who can just go off on their own and knock it out of the park. But over time, those skills can be learned. Those skills can be taught. And if you stay connected, then you can do a much more lasting work. And I wanted to show you guys just a little chunk of our matrix that we use, or our spreadsheet for keeping track of how students are doing. We don't just track whether people have mastered the skills of making a good coffee. In fact, you'll see that's basically nowhere on here. Whether or not they can pull a good shot of espresso or steam a good pitcher of milk, make a good flat white. We are tracking things like, are people demonstrating agency and a growth mindset? How's their confidence doing on a weekly basis? You know, a lot of these people are really struggling with different social disorders or things of that nature. And being able to have a systematized way of supporting them and making sure that they're moving in a positive direction is really, really critical for maintaining those relationships and maintaining a good result. A lot of these people we are helping into work, or we are referring to jobs, and being able to keep up with them is really, really critical to make sure they stay supported afterwards. So just sort of bringing it all back together at the end of this, when you're designing for social change, there are different things that you have to consider besides just efficiencies, what will work well, what will give the best customer experience, that sort of thing. And these are themes that came up over and over again when I was listening to the presentations from the students at RCA. These ideas that we have to take into account existing power structures, or else what we do isn't going to make any difference. We have to design around the people at the bottom of the food chain, the least well-off people. And we have to design with relationships in mind, and if we're going to make real sustainable change in the long term. I would say out of the 20 or so students I talked to, over and over, these themes came up in at least 15 of those conversations. How we're gonna think about these things in doing a good service design. And I think the final thing that came up was that this is essentially a massive opportunity for competitive advantage. This is something that you as designers can sell to potential clients. From a productivity perspective, these things can be really, really useful. Happy employees who are being well taken care of, they're employees that perform better and they give your message to the world better. So designing with relationships in mind is a critical way to, maintain sort of employee engagement and employee well-being. And things like designing for an ethical or a more ethical way of doing business are things that companies are hugely interested right now. Every company, as the consumer base becomes more interested in ethical consumption, is more interested in, okay, how do we do business in a more ethical way? So quite unusually, the right thing to do right now, which I think is designing socially, is also good business. So it's this perfect nexus of a time where you can do this sort of design and companies will be interested in it. So it can be really, really useful to you guys as you're sort of selling your service design and your services to potential customers to be thinking in these sorts of ways.
That's awesome, Micah. Thank you so much for sharing that. I wonder if I can ask you a few questions on some of that. I found it.
Oh yeah.
I found it super fascinating, and to almost reflect on how you presented that. I thought it was really, really interesting for the students as well, maybe to get to look at everything that you presented through the lens of time. So if you are approaching a project with limited time, almost the first point that you raise around understand where power and where risk takes place in the supply chain and focus there. If you've only got 2 months or 3 months to explore a project, look at those because they're the obvious quick places that you can see. And then we can talk a little bit more about risk because I've got some questions about that, which I found fascinating. If you've got more time to explore on a project, then dig a bit deeper than just where the power is and develop an awareness. So whether that's of legislative change in order for you to be able to exploit, opportunities, or whether that sends understanding of awareness of capabilities. But if you've got more time to engage in a project, don't just look at where the power is and the risk is. Get involved awareness and actually identify aspirations of some of the communities you're working with. And then if you've got the most time, if you've got a year or two, you frame it as in, well, then develop the craft of relationship, develop deep and meaningful relationships with the people you're working with. And so it felt like a really beautiful kind of time-based way of being able to approach change. If it's a limited thing, look at power, and then more awareness and change. So is that a fair, quick kind of time?
I think that's an excellent summation.
So I loved if we just drop back in for a second in terms of talking about the beginning bit. I'm just making sure that I'm not missing anything in the chats now. The first point, I really loved that. Almost when you were talking about risk, almost this sense of on the supply chain, neighborhoods or communities that can mobilize quickly have the potential for greater power. And in your funnel, it was like the ones that mobilized the quickest were the importers and exporters because they were smaller and they could actually, so that's a really, well, before we go and make an assumption, is that a fair assumption to make?
Yeah, it's definitely places that can mobilize quickly, and you can see examples of that even outside of just the center of the funnel in the coffee industry. Like, for instance, roasters that act as a cartel. There's some really interesting examples of, say, 5 or 6 roasters that band together to increase their market power, but they act as one. But I would say that's about as big as it can go, right? Because once you get to, say, the cafe level, there are thousands of cafes in the UK, and there's no way that they're going to band together and act as one. So that's really, really critical if you want to make change, if you want to have power. How much you can consolidate to move quickly.
So that's a really helpful snapshot, and so therefore and also it was like shocking but really helpful and illuminating to just underline again, often those with the least power in the supply chain end up having to take the greatest risk.
Always.
Right. And so you're framing some really important concepts for the role of anybody that wants to create change through applying design skills by identifying where is the greatest risk, or another way is where is the person with the least power, in this chain. In terms of intervention, can either design look at mobilizing neighborhoods, and obviously if the number is too great, like consumers or farmers, then actually there are more creative ways of doing that, and or to the example you gave, are there ways of upstream sharing risk by finding neighborhoods that are willing to take on that risk? Because I would imagine that creative contract you developed wasn't necessarily universally sort of like welcomed. You had to find the right kind of people to want to engage with that.
Yeah, it was. And I think quite notably, the part of the reason that the power is constricted in the middle of that funnel is flow of information. So it's really, really key. If you can get a good information flow, say from farmers, from one end of the funnel, farmers, to the other end of the funnel, consumers, or at least retailers and cafes, then that's when power tends to shift, right? Because you've basically closed the loop. You've let retailers and cafes know how farmers are suffering, what they need, what could be helpful to them. And then that puts pressure on the rest of the funnel because they no longer restrict all of the information. They no longer control that. And so that really enables you to mobilize that broad base of power that's at the bottom and the top.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, and super helpful as well. And I guess, yet another lens of exploring your presentation is that actually your starting point was around systemic design and understanding how systems and neighborhoods can better interact to be able to share risk in a more ethical way. And then the deeper you went into the presentation, the less it was about systems and the more it became about people and then ultimately about individuals, which I think was a great narrative. And so moving on to the second part that I also found super interesting around awareness. And so like one of the first things that came to my mind is that how do you keep yourself legislatively aware? So to be able to, was it in Ethiopia, to be able to suddenly exploit that law and become the first organization to be able to use the kind of liberty that was given by that particular law. How do you stay in touch and inform yourself in terms of legislative change?
I think that's really about working with local partners because they're always going to be, whether that's, local partners, say you're working internationally, or that's local partners, getting down to the nitty gritty with the community you're trying to work in. Those are the people who are going to be attuned to things like that. These changes in laws are going to affect them most directly, and they're going to affect their livelihoods. It's going to affect everything that they care about. So they're always going to know and they're going to tell you. So that's, again, moving more into the relationship thing, but staying connected with whoever those local partners are in a real and tangible way, not just over email, but being face to face with them, being in the same physical location so that you hear things that they're saying that they might not think is important right off the bat. But maybe you might be able to recognize, oh, that's quite critical actually to the way we might be able to do business. I think that's how you do that.
That's really, and I guess, if we were to look at how you presented in terms of systemic neighborhoods and individuals, that understanding of neighborhoods or sends awareness of the capabilities of, neighborhoods and their aspirations. I guess it creates within it the blend between systemic design and human interaction, because you're not necessarily going in too deep on an individual, building a relationship with individuals in the way that we'll explore in a second, but it is having that understanding, which I guess is, and it's something you didn't share, but it was what's really fascinating with me about how you yourself in your practice not required for the work that you've been in, but the neighborhoods that you've engaged in, that you've lived in and you've worked in, you've totally immersed yourself culturally. And so whilst that might be second nature for you, a lot of service design students would say, okay, that's absolutely understanding, that's taking co-creation to the nth degree. That's immersing yourself in a culture and being able to be fluent in that culture, not fluent in the language per se, although I know that you can speak multiple languages, but it's actually being fluent in the culture, which is even more intense than just the language. And so I just wondered if you'd be up for sharing a little bit about cuisine and food. Because it's something that you're really good at, but part of what makes you really good at it is that you've immersed yourself in the culture. So can you just share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, actually, because the way that people interact is often centered around food and drink. I mean, we all know if you go out with somebody for drinks, you're likely to hear way more interesting information than if you're just chatting with them in the workplace, or if you're just, sending them an email back and forth. But yeah, really getting invested in the idea of eating together with people, drinking together with people, getting into their lives on that level is where you find out what people actually value. It's where you find out what's really, really important to people in their work life and their personal life. And that gives you the opportunity to design things in a way that will be really meaningful to them, which is what gets people coming back to you. It's what makes people want to keep working with you, is this idea that you have invested in their culture, their food, their drink, in their livelihood, and understood it in a way that allows you to design your business or whatever it is that you're designing in a way that takes that into account and fulfills as many of those needs as you possibly can.
I think that's absolutely fascinating. It's probably worth an area of deep dive and research in of itself. I know that in last term, some of the students on the Alternative to Recall project, when they shared about how food is so important to them, it's like a primary go-to. But I'm actually thinking about the two biggest areas of work that I've engaged with over the last 15 years, so homelessness and, let's say, the prison estate. Both of those have very strong food cultures. They're both sets of communities, have go-tos in terms of what food looks like. And actually engaging in understanding those food cultures is a conduit for understanding those neighborhoods. So going back to Sen's awareness of capabilities, sometimes it's not through just asking or even observing. Sometimes it's through immersion of really understanding the capabilities, right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. If you want to truly be able to co-create and do an excellent job in designing for a neighborhood or a community or, whatever group of people it might be, immersing yourself is critical, because otherwise you're just this outside voice with no idea of what these people actually value or what they actually need. And I think that's where you see people in the charity world or in, the sort of greenwashed world do far more harm than good. They go into a situation with very little immersion into the culture and learning of what people actually value, and they try to change things. And I think a great example of this I saw once with a really well-intentioned Dutch nonprofit that came into an African nation. It was in Chad, actually. I was doing a bit of work there. And this really well-intentioned Dutch group came in, and they basically input an irrigation system that would massively increase these farmers' yields, I think tenfold, in the order of tenfold. And it was brilliant. They set the whole thing up. They taught the people how to use the system, and they split up ownership of the system, which they thought was really brilliant. So one guy owned the pump, another guy owned, the lines themselves, another guy owned the building that the pump was housed in, and then they left. And what they failed to understand is that when they left, essentially the pump broke within 2 years, and the chap who owned the pump went around trying to levy, basically contributions to fix that pump, get the system back on its feet, and no one was interested in that because he owned the pump, and they're like, why should I give you money to fix your pump? And so the whole system fell into disrepair, and everyone went back to farming exactly the same way and that they had before, and they weren't really bothered by that, because they didn't value the tenfold harvest. They valued, essentially, they thought it was nice when it was happening, don't get me wrong, but they didn't think that was super important to them. They had enough harvest from their old traditional ways of doing it, and they didn't think it was important enough to help Joe over here fix his pump to get the irrigation system back up and running, because that wasn't theirs.
Yes. I mean, when you break down some of those stories, like the one you just shared, or the breakdown of where our money goes for coffee. I mean, when we see that, it's both shocking and sobering at the same time, and it also causes us to question, what kind of intervention do we really want to create? So you shared initially around systemic design and understanding where risk is at and where power is at. You then took us on a journey of neighborhood awareness, understanding capabilities, and neighborhoods becoming conduits of information, informing us on legislative change, and immersion into neighborhoods through culture and through food. And so the final part that you shared, which I thought was fascinating, was around the craft of relationships. And I mean, that craftsmanship is something that it's like one of my ideals. I think the craftsman in all of us needs to be freed. But Richard Sennett writes a lot about craftsmanship and talks and explains it essentially as it is the act of making something and then getting better and making it well. And when you were sharing about relationships, it being that kind of the most deepest sense of real change that you were doing through Pro Baristas and through your experience of doing that and working with people individually, there was that real sense of not just focusing on the technical skills, but focusing on core competencies and possibly even touching on value base as you develop a relationship. And it struck me as you were sharing that we interview and we put job ads out for skills and experience, and we rarely talk about values and core competencies. And so we seem to put a high prestige on technical skills and experience, and yet the fundamentals of like the craft of relationship is our value base, right, and our core competencies. I just wondered whether what you've seen in like immersing yourself in relationships, both the Pro Baristas and the other relationships that I know you've created, across the world, how you've seen that balance work.
Yeah, I think probably the most indicative thing I can think of is the difference between the 3 different restaurants that I started. In 2 of them, we had people with excellent, skills in terms of, making food, serving food, doing everything really well, bartenders good, all that sort of thing. And those were good. They were successful, they did all right. The place that really, really took off was the one where one of the managers was a master of making people feel connected and like they were in relationship. And that place had of the three restaurants, that place had the worst food and the worst drinks of any of the three places, but it did 3 times the business. And that was essentially because it had one person who, in talking to staff or in talking to customers, made them feel connected. And that's a really unique skill set, but it's also something that can be taught over time. And it's really indicative of what people value. You know, people value feeling connected more than they value a great meal, even if they're going to a place that's literally there to give them a great meal, like a restaurant. That feeling of connection was far more important.
That's amazing. And yeah, I mean, it echoes very much my own understanding as well of human connection fundamentally creates, you know, a deeper engagement. And for sure, I can think of places that I will even go to, or coffee shops, or cafes or restaurants, where actually the connection is possibly better than the actual product. But it's the connection that makes the atmosphere, and it creates those environments that you want to be around, which is super important. And actually, not just super important in terms of creating, you know, successful cafes and restaurants, super important in understanding the creation of experiences and positive experiences. And whilst the development of like really good product is important, it shouldn't be at the expense of like meaningful connections, which is, I guess, you know, where you beautifully took us down that journey. And I'm aware that we're coming up to like time now. It's like 55. But I was going to quickly just summarize, and then, you know, give you the opportunity to jump in at any point as well, Micah. But for the students that are listening and that will rewatch this, here's a really great opportunity to deep dive into the understanding of systemic design and how we can affect systems and how we can affect the neighborhoods that operate within those systems and engage with awareness of those neighborhoods. And then ultimately, how we can engage deeper with the individuals within the neighborhoods, within the systems, to be able to see the most amount of change possible, and probably the most ethical amount of change possible. Is there anything that you wanted to add on to that, Mike?
Not too much, but just to reiterate that all of these things not only make social sense, but they make business sense. And we see over and over again, actually, like when research is done into what makes an employee feel good about their job, for instance, that what makes them feel good about their job is a little bit about the money. It's a little bit about the opportunities, but it's about feeling valued, and it's about the connections, and it's about feeling like they're doing something that makes a difference. And so these things might seem very soft, and they might seem a bit unimportant in the hard corporate world, but they're actually critical to how places that are successful do business.
That's brilliant. And you're absolutely spot on. And probably, I think there's definitely a deep dive worth into exploring everything that we've just talked about, systemic, neighborhoods, and individuals, through the lens of actually why that's meaningful for business to do that. So that's probably another session that we can do. And definitely that kind of how we can engage culturally in neighborhoods. I think that's also probably something worth revisiting. Micah, thank you so much for your time. I know that we're going to create some space for you to be able to connect individually and one-to-ones with some of the students who are going to be doing their elected major projects as well. But thank you so much. This has been brilliant, and I'll see you soon.
Thanks, Judah.
Thanks, guys. Hey,
Hey, Mr. Weekend.
oh, Mr. Downtown. Um, oh, hold on. Are we still streaming? Let me just see.